Hello and welcome to the NLIHC National HoUSed campaign call. I'm Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. As I mentioned, this is our National HoUSed campaign call, and we launched our campaign to focus on advancing anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale sustained investments that we need in order to ensure that people with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. And we launched this campaign because we were recognizing that more than ever, we need bold policy solutions to help address the affordable housing crisis. So today we're really excited to have all of you with us and so many great experts with us today to talk about the anticipated threats that we see ahead in terms of policy changes to immigration law and housing law that would target undocumented people and other immigrant families under the incoming Trump administration, and how all of you as advocates can take action to help ensure that all people have access to affordable housing. We're going to hear from Esther Reyes from the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, a campaign that we have worked really closely with, who's going to share an overview of past Trump administration policy changes and how they relate to housing access for immigrants and what we can expect going forward with the Trump administration. We'll also hear from Kate Walls from the National Housing Law Project and Sonia Acosta from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who are going to talk a little bit about the ways that all of us mobilized during the first Trump administration to push back against cruel and harmful proposals that targeted undocumented people. And then finally, we'll hear from next steps from both Esther and Kayla Blackwell, who is on NLIHC staff, who are going to talk about advocacy opportunities and ways that we can all take action together to help protect folks in our communities. On our call today, we have listeners who are from across the country, including homeless service and shelter providers, housing advocates, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including low-income individuals who are receiving or are in need of federal housing assistance. We have folks that are experiencing homelessness on the call, philanthropy, and media as well. And as a reminder, we are strictly nonpartisan in all of the work that we do. We use these calls to talk about cutting-edge issues that are impacting housing at the federal level and to share with all of you ways that you can take action in your communities. So before we jump into the agenda, I did want to remind folks that they can ask questions in the Q&A box. That's a little bit easier for us to follow than in the chat box. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And after today's call, we'll share this PowerPoint presentation and any of the materials that our speakers mentioned. We'll share that with you by the end of the week so that you can follow up in more detail. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to get started right away with Esther Reyes from the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, who's going to share with us an overview of past administration proposals and what we expect going forward. Thanks, Esther.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Esther Reyes, and I'm campaign strategist with the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition. Next year is going to be a really busy and important year for advocates, and a really impactful year for our communities. And so we are preparing, just like we did the first time around, to really be able to respond and push back against some of the attacks that we anticipate. And so I wanted to share a little bit first about kind of the landscape and the leadership of the administration right now, and how that is carried over from the first administration in part, and then how that's really going to impact some of the things that we expect to see. So we've seen that the Trump administration, the first time around, was very focused, had a lot of focus on immigration policies from border enforcement to an attack on public benefits. And some of the leaders within his administration that were part of that system are going to be back. We've already seen that Stephen Miller is going to be behind the scenes and involved as deputy chief of staff. We have Tom Homan, who also has 30 plus years of immigration enforcement, and he's been named and appointed as the border czar. And then we have Christy Noem, who is appointed to be DH secretary and the governor of South Dakota. And she has been supportive of sending National Guard troops to Texas. So what we're really seeing is a concentration of some very of leaders who have already demonstrated a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment and willingness to carry out policies without a lot of consideration for the impact on families and access to benefits, and families including those with citizen children. And so to give a little bit more of an idea of what the specific threats in immigration that we are expecting, we categorize them currently in two buckets. One bucket is to further eliminate any legal options for low-income people of color to adjust status. So we're expecting, given Project 2025, an elimination of UNT visas, TPS, and student and exchange visitor programs, and a number of other visa options for being or remaining in the United States. Another thing we're expecting is a big focus, well, the other shift is a big focus on merit-based immigration visas rather than family-based immigration. And so this would obviously really impact a lot, mostly people of color, immigrants of color who are coming from poor countries and are fleeing violence and poverty in their countries. We're also expecting, an attack on DACA, TPS, possibly, well, not possibly, we're expecting a large concentration of resources and staff for enforcement of immigration policies. So not just border enforcement, but also interior enforcement, which would include raids at workplaces and possibly as well in locations that were previously considered sensitive, locations where there was an agreement where immigration would not conduct any of its activities in certain places like schools and churches and such, where people were going and they needed to feel the safety to be able to participate. And then, of course, we're seeing the big threat on public charge. The last time around, we did see an attack on public charge in an attempt to expand the categories of programs that were going to be considered in a public charge test for the people that it applies for. Now, just to briefly lay out what public charge is part of an immigration regulation that it's a rule, essentially, that is used to determine whether or not a person who is trying to enter the United States or adjust status will be considered a public charge or a cost to the country. Historically, this regulation has been and continues actually to be very, very narrow, and it does not apply to the vast majority of people who apply to adjust status. However, during the Trump administration, it did expand it to include some programs that were previously not included in that public charge determination. But what's really worse than that is that it wasn't even the policy itself that created what we call a chilling effect in families. What really caused that was a leaked memo, right, from the Trump administration before any regulation had been even presented or proposed. And that spread like wildfire. And we saw huge disenrollments in public benefits programs among immigrant communities, for fear that it would affect their immigration status or would put them at risk for deportation or a number of other immigration consequences. So the important thing here is, we pushed back and we were able to delay that public charge, that final rule, for months. And we employed some incredible strategies. We were able to bring a lot of partners together, and we'll go into this a little bit more later. And then during the Biden administration, we successfully had the Trump public charge rule reversed. However, we are expecting again a threat on public charge. And so we know that there are mechanisms in place and processes that the Trump administration would have to go through to really change that regulation. And we'll be prepared, and we are preparing now to be able to defend against that. I'm not sure how much more time I have, but I'll just take one more minute, if that's okay, to share a little bit about some of the healthcare and food assistance, housing, and other programs that we expect to be under attack, a few of them at least. We are expecting, or Project 2025 did outline as a priority, a HUD rule to bar any non-citizen who is not a legal permanent resident in a household from receiving any kind of housing assistance. We're expecting an attack on the availability of community eligibility for school meals, also ending any kind of federal financial aid to states that grant access, immigrants access to in-state tuition, regardless of status, and limited benefits and more restrictions and lifetime caps on programs like Medicaid. So we are expecting to see a lot of these come pretty soon, once the new administration begins. And we are preparing in it, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, about how we will be pushing back and fighting and partnering with our partners at NLIHC, and many others, to really respond, and protect our families as much as we can.
Thank you so much for that, Esther. I'm just reminded about when we first started working with PIF, it was in response to the public charge rule and the mixed status rule that you just referred to. And since that time, I think our organizations have built a really strong working relationship that wasn't there before, which I think is going to be really helpful. I think with the new administration and many of the policy changes that we're anticipating. I do have a question for you though. What's different, I think, this time around is that both the Trump administration and in Project 2025, they've talked about wanting to fire career staff and replace them with political appointees. I know we've had a lot of conversations about what does that mean in terms of HUD, but how does that impact the way that you're thinking about the policy changes that this administration might push forward?
That's a great observation. Definitely something that we are considering. I think there's a couple of ways or a couple of implications that we see, as far as, really bringing political appointees. One is a very shallow understanding of many of these, the processes and procedures that, rules and regulations and administrative processes or orders have to follow in order to really, to be allowed, right? And not just a lack of understanding as far as the government process, but also a really shallow or non-existent understanding of what the problems that these agencies are supposed to be addressing, what those are, right? In some instances, like immigration, they are bringing some folks who have had a lot of experience in this, but very much on the enforcement and family separation piece. But what we're seeing with others are just, who he's planning to bring for. I can't remember the name, but my point is that yes, we're expecting just not a lack of expertise and a lack of experience and knowledge on the substance and the matter that these programs are going to be leading. And another thing that's also going to cause is, our own relationships with people within agencies and within these departments, and how we're able to communicate with them in some of the advocacy that we do. So we're expecting kind of a really harsher, um, I guess, just connection. It's going to be a harder connection for us. But what we, in some ways, I guess the silver lining is that we are much more familiar with how changes can be made and how they cannot be made. And so we can rally our own, allies and partners to step in when something is being done that's out of order or unlawfully.
Just one more question for you. I know that you talked about the public charge rule, which is the rule that the government uses to figure out, they look at public benefits that you might have received, and they use that information to determine whether or not you're allowed to become a citizen of the United States. And for many people, you had mentioned this chilling effect where even if the policy itself doesn't, severely restrict access to benefits, people are going to be afraid to access those resources because out of fear of it impacting their future immigration status. But of course, those people are still here and they're going to still have needs that aren't being met. So maybe you could share with us, if that were to take place, what does that do to state and local governments that have to step in and sort of pick up the needs that households have because they can't access federal resources? And what's the impact on the families themselves?
The impact is I'll start with that last part. The impact is going to be huge. We know that people that receive the benefits that are considered in a public charge determination when they're trying to adjust status, most of those people are eligible for those. And if they're not eligible, or rather, the other way to say it is most people who are not eligible for these programs, they can't even use them. So even if they're considered in a public charge determination, they don't have access to them for a number of eligibility reasons, right? And so the concern is those who are eligible and are currently using them, and the effect that that's going to have on withdrawing children, many of who are U.S. citizens, from being able to access these basic services and benefits, and just opportunities and avenues for care. Um, we, our state partners have already expressed concern about um, an overwhelm on the system at the state and local level, because when you don't feel comfortable accessing government benefits, you're going to see a huge increase or a huge demand on the private, sector, charity sector, or other food banks or local programs that bear some of these costs. And we also know that sometimes the resources there are limited as well, not because they should be, but because we put limits on. We have this mindset, right, that there's just not enough to go around. But I'm in Texas. We already have the highest or the lowest rate of uninsured adults and children in the entire country. We saw a huge drop after the first public charge rule, or even just the announcement of the possibility of a change of a public charge rule. And then we saw another huge drop during what we call the Medicaid unwinding, which was the end of the continuous coverage of Medicaid during the pandemic. And so what we're going to continue to see is more attacks that are going to compound upon each other, to really create or exacerbate um, the barriers and the needs that already vulnerable communities are facing.
I so appreciate that, like bringing it back to the impact on real people and what does it mean for them and their families. I know we're going to be in very close contact with PIF going forward. And I hope everyone else on this call, you'll hear a little bit more from Esther at the end of the call about ways that you can take action. But I hope you too, folks on the call today listening, also connect with the PIF campaign, and to find ways to make connections in your own communities too, to help push back against harmful proposals. So thank you so much for joining with us, Esther.
Thank you.
Now we're going to turn to Kate Walls from the National Housing Law Project, and then a little bit after that to Sonia Acosta from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And they're going to share different sides of how our two organizations, the National Income Housing Coalition and the Law Project, work together as part of the Keep Families Together campaign. This was the campaign that was launched during the first Trump administration to help protect mixed status immigrant households. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'm Kate Walls. I'm the Associate Director of Litigation at the National Housing Law Project. I'm going to give a little background first on the mixed status rule that Esther talked about briefly. So the mixed status rule comes from Section 214 of the Housing and Community Development Act. Under that law, Congress was limiting access in certain housing programs run by HUD and USDA to eligible immigrants. However, at the same time, Congress made explicitly clear that mixed status families, which means families with eligible immigration status, including household members without eligible immigration status, such as an individual who's undocumented, can continue to live together in housing subject to Section 214. So this was Congress's explicit directive to the USDA and HUD that mixed status families be allowed to continue to live together. And that was the law of the land until the first Trump administration. And what we saw then was HUD proposed a rule that would have required mixed status families to leave HUD-assisted housing if not every household member had eligible immigration status. It would have resulted in 25,000 families leaving HUD-assisted housing that they were eligible for under the law and with the intent of Congress. And it would have affected 55,000 children around the country. And some of the comments that we looked at, more than 75% of the families within a public housing authority would have been evicted as a result of this rule. So this rule was proposed and put in the Federal Register, but it never was finalized, and I'll talk about why that is. And then the USDA notified in the Federal Register that it was also going to propose essentially the same rule, that it would have had the same effect of tearing apart mixed status families in USDA housing, and requiring them to either split up or to be evicted from their homes, because under that rule as well, only individuals with eligible immigration status could remain in the homes. Sonia's going to talk in more detail about this, but our two organizations, the National Income Housing Coalition and the National Housing Law Project, came together to create the Keep Families Together campaign, and from that generated 30,000 unique and diverse comments, which is really key to successfully defeating these hateful and racist rules. And so there were comments from public housing authorities, from health professionals, from homelessness services, from state and local governments, from housing advocates, all describing in different ways the economic effects, the public effects, the local and state government drains that would be caused by advancing such hateful rules. In April of 2021, the Biden administration formally rescinded the proposed HUD mixed status rule, so it was never finalized and then officially rescinded. That's important. That means they will have to start all over if they do this again, which we anticipate that they will. RD never even proposed a rule in the Federal Register. They would also have to start over. They unofficially announced that they were not moving forward with their mixed status rule as well. I will turn it over now to Sonia to talk about the campaign itself and why it was so successful.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. I'm Sonia Costa, she, her pronouns. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. But prior to this role, I was a policy analyst at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, where I helped lead this campaign in 2019. And so kind of to piggyback on what Kate was talking about, the goal of, there were several different aspects to the goals here, but one was really to get as many unique comments as possible to slow down the process. Because as part of the regulatory process, federal agencies need to respond to each comment when they issue a final rule. So we wanted to have as many comments as possible, as well as just to kind of show the extent of the opposition to this proposed rule. We also worked with partners in the housing space, in the immigration space, folks who really had deep expertise to encourage them to write detailed technical comments that would also be kind of, again, would take time for HUD to look through and respond to. And I know that folks who are at the National Housing Law Project were also thinking about what kind of information should be in some of those detailed comments to kind of lay out the groundwork for any possible litigation. I'm not a lawyer, so I was not very involved with that. I was much more focused on doing some of the education work and encouraging people to submit comments. So to talk a little bit about what that looked like, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, National Housing Law Project, worked in coalition with many other groups, including Center on Budget, where I'm at now, but groups kind of representing folks across issue areas, really showing a broad opposition to this. We worked with them to join Hill meetings, send out information, right? These folks all have their own lists, email lists, and wanting to make sure that as many people knew what was going on as possible. Asking them to speak on webinars or conduct analysis. So thinking about education specifically, we did do quite a few Hill meetings to encourage members of Congress to express their opposition to this proposed rule. Representative Sylvia Garcia from Texas and Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York actually introduced bills that would block HUD from implementing this proposed rule, which was great. And so then just trying to build support for those bills was part of this. But we also did a lot to just create accessible materials explaining the rule and its impact. It does get a little bit wonky and technical, so wanting to make sure that folks who don't have deep expertise in housing programs could understand them was really important. And so we put out fact sheets, FAQs, different materials like that. Folks at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, so some of my current colleagues, did really, really amazing analysis showing impacts at the state level, right? How many families would be impacted in different states so that we could use those materials in our advocacy. They also did analysis of the demographics of who those families, that's 25,000 families that Kate referenced who they were and showed some of the disparities. So a lot of them were families with children, a lot of them were Latino. So that was another really helpful resource for us in our advocacy. We also hosted at least one webinar that I can remember. You know, to be clear, this was a about 3-month period in 2019. So I could definitely be misremembering small details or forgetting things. So keep that in mind. And I'm sure some of my colleagues at the coalition might remember some things that I've forgotten. But one of the huge things is that we had a website. And so that hosted all of these resources that we created to make sure that they were publicly available. And we would keep it updated as we, you know, as there was new research published, or we, you know, wrote a new fact sheet or something like that. And part of the website was a comment portal, and this was really key and huge. So the main regulations.gov site to submit comments on proposed rules is not the most accessible or easy to navigate. So we worked with a service to create this comment portal, which would allow people to submit comments through our microsite. And then the comments would then be submitted through, you know, the regular regulations.gov site. But that also helped make sure that there were resources right there for people as they were commenting. You know, we had tips and tricks and guidance for folks as they were writing a comment. We had a longer, like, detailed comment template for folks who wanted to get into the weeds that was not posted, but could be requested to help people get into some of those legal arguments. And the comment portal also had like rotating prompts for folks. So again, we were really trying to get as many unique comments as possible. So we had different, you know, iterations focusing on different points. And again, really encouraging people to add in why they cared about this rule, the impact that it would have in their communities, all of those things, why it mattered to them. And we were also able to work with some really wonderful partners who were translated comments submitted in Spanish into English, because the comments needed to be submitted in English for regulations.gov. But this allowed folks who spoke Spanish, felt more comfortable writing in Spanish, to still submit comments, which was very helpful. We did have like a day of action where we encouraged groups to host comment parties. Just again, any way to encourage the broader public as well as just housing advocates to submit comments. I know that there was some really great media outreach, and I think some helpful press around this that kind of elevated the issue a little bit. And like Kate said, this was a really successful defensive campaign. We had more than 30,000 comments submitted. That was a record for a HUD proposed rule, as far as I'm aware. Previously, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule from 2015 got about 1,000 comments. So this was a huge increase. And an analysis of those comments showed that about 99% of them were in opposition to the proposed rule. And we didn't, you know, the Trump administration did not release a final rule. And then, of course, the Biden administration withdrew the proposal, as Kate mentioned. So I will stop there.
Thanks, Sonia. Maybe Kate can come back online too, because there's a lot of good questions here for you guys. You mentioned that, both of you mentioned that the Trump administration rescinded the rule before it was finalized. And is that because there was so much public comments that were submitted in opposition, or why do you think that they didn't move forward with their harmful proposal?
Yeah, and I should clarify, the Trump administration never rescinded it. either rule, the RD rule or the HUD rule. It's that they never finalized them. So they never published a final rule for HUD. They had a proposed rule, and they never issued a proposed rule for RD. And I do think that it's both the stellar work of Keep Families Together, but also career staff, which sort of goes to your earlier question, Sarah, who were very dedicated and pointing out, there's a huge conflict with the statute if they would change the rules so that mixed status families can't live together when it's Congress's express intent. And so when that happened, plus the wide and varied comments that they got that they had to address, or they were looking at a legal challenge, slowed everything down so that day one of the Biden administration, there was an executive order on supporting and welcoming immigrant families in the United States. And one of the specific directives, in addition to looking at the public charge rule, was looking at the mixed status rule.
That's super helpful. I think it's helpful for folks to know that when they're submitting a public comment, it's part of this larger strategy to slow down, delay, prevent. And it might feel like, what's my comment going to do? I'm just one person with one comment, but it really adds up when people across the country are joining together. There is a question from Danielle who asks about, is it possible for the incoming administration to do away with the public comment requirements, given that it was so helpful in all of us in pushing back last time?
This is a statutory obligation that they have under the Administrative Procedures Act. That would have to take then an act of Congress to amend it and to upend how we do rulemaking in the United States. I don't think that's going to happen. You would think it's possible that they will learn their lesson from the last administration. There was a number of lawsuits, one planned on mixed status, as Sonia mentioned, the public charge, very successful public charge litigation, but other litigation too, where they didn't correctly follow the Administrative Procedures Act. There's one school of thought that they'll get it right this time. I think I heard from Professor David Super 2 weeks ago who said, true ideologues are coming into the building, they won't get it right. And so they'll be subject to those challenges again.
Thanks for that. I see there's a question from Chris Schilt who's asking, what can public housing agencies do now to protect the mixed status households that are living in HUD housing? And I guess similarly, what can advocates do or residents do in terms of engaging with public housing authorities?
Sonia, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So I don't know that there's that much to do preemptively. I want to, and hopefully I can find the link to share it in the chat. I want to lift up, I believe it's the Cambridge Public Housing Agency that recently used their status as a moving to work agency to change how they're providing assistance to families whose immigration statuses, who have different immigration statuses, so the mixed status families. Right now, how it works is that assistance is prorated to only cover those who are eligible. And this housing agency has gone through a long legal process to provide assistance to the entire household and not just those who are eligible through their moving to work flexibilities. So if agencies are moving to work, they could look into that. I think also this is a place where state and local governments who are interested in doing something on housing can look at how can we provide rental assistance to families who are immigrants, regardless of kind of what immigration status they have, knowing that federal resources might be under attack. So I am not sure exactly what housing agencies can do, but I think state and local governments do have a role to play. But yeah, not sure, Kate, if you have other ideas.
Public Housing Authority provided some of the strongest and most solid comments as to why the rule was completely unworkable and why their current structure did work and was actually saved them money because families are paying a prorated rent. They are not getting the full housing benefit. It only goes to those families with eligible immigration status. And so I would say PHAs join forces with us again to oppose and fight these hateful policies. I think the other important rule is something that Esther pointed out at the beginning. The chilling effect is often worse than the actual policy. So encourage families to stay in programs if they need them. If they've secured that housing assistance already, that information is out there. So they should continue to get that housing assistance until the law changes, but it may not because there's an army of people willing to fight it.
That's a good segue. There's a question here too about how do we educate the public? And I think there's like a corollary to that too. Like, how do we educate mixed status households about their rights under these programs? And how do we educate the public about the role that immigrants play in our communities? This question is coming from Jennifer, who I think is rightfully saying that in many of these conversations, immigrants have been made to be scapegoats and sort of blamed for the housing crisis, when we know that the housing crisis goes far beyond immigrants in our communities. There is a systemic lack of incomes that aren't keeping up with housing costs. There's not enough housing supply, especially for extremely low-income households. So how do we educate the public, and how do we educate mixed status households who might be impacted?
Again, I think it's really important, both with public charge and mixed status, to be educating families that at this point, nothing has changed. You should stay and get the benefits that you are entitled to. And if the law would change, we're going to know way in advance. If you think about it, one of the benefits of at the federal level is things don't move quickly. It's going to take them a year to 18 months to get out of a proposed rule. That's still not a change. And then another year potentially to finalize it, especially if there are a lot of comments, wide and varied, in opposition. And so don't make any moves now. Talk to Protecting Immigrant Families, talk to us, talk to local immigration experts about your options, but don't make any moves without talking to someone, because at this point, the law is on your side in terms of public charge and mixed status.
Thanks. And I'll just add that Delaney Wallace is putting in a plug, Sonia, for Center on Budget to provide updated demographic data like they did for during the first Trump administration about the mixed status rule. So I'm sure you'll take that back to your colleagues. And also just to thank both of you guys for joining with us. I know there'll be a lot of other opportunities to engage on this issue with all of you, and we appreciate you joining today. Great. And now we'll move on to ways that you can take action. How can you prepare for 2025? We'll invite back Esther Reyes from Protecting Immigrant Families, and also invite Kayla from NLIHC to join on. Kayla and Esther, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Sarah. My name is Kayla Blackwell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a policy analyst here at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. You might be wondering what there is to do after all that information and the great background and review we just had from Sonia and Kate and Esther. Thank you all so much. I first just want to highlight again the work of the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition. You know, at the intersection of housing and immigrant access to benefits, the PIF Coalition, it has been a great partner, and I think we'll continue working really closely with them over the next administration. I also just want to highlight one of Kate's last few points is that despite the fear and, you know, hateful rhetoric that might be coming about, nothing has yet changed. And our biggest ask besides, educating and preparing yourself and learning about what we've fought before, is to stay engaged. If you're not already connected to an immigrant rights advocacy organization in your community, now is a great time to do so. If you are a housing provider looking to see how to support immigrant communities, that would be a great natural partnership. And NLIHC will continue to stay engaged with our partners in the immigration space, especially TIF, and we encourage you to do so. Yes, I did just put this link in the chat, and invite you to learn more about the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition, sign up for their newsletters, and stay in touch with NLIHC as we continue to learn more. I think I had another link, but Esther, did you have much to add?
Yeah, thanks, Kayla. Thanks so much for just lifting up the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign. I think that one of our real strengths is the depth and the breadth of our partners in our network, and the many diverse sectors and voices that are part of us. And so there's an opportunity for really any kind of organization to be involved in our network. We offer working groups that are very specific on issues or matters like federal advocacy or state policy advocacy. We have working groups who focus on community education. So if you're interested in really getting some of those materials or providing feedback as we develop materials to do outreach with our communities, that would be a great working group to join. And we have several other working groups. Really, I think that we need as many people to be involved and aware of what's happening. One of the things that we've learned is that our communities need to hear things over and over and over again, for them to really feel like they can believe something. And so the more people we have just providing this information, when they're working with them on the ground, when they're with, whether it's through a local official or a school administrator, the coalitions and the connections we can establish to really amplify those messages and get those out are going to be really important, because fear spreads a lot faster, right, than truth and fact. And so we have to be just vigilant and stay ahead of things as much as we can. We do have already some materials that you are welcome to check out on our website. I'll drop a link here before we leave, so you can check out some of those toolkits that you can begin to use now. So people at least know they can come to you, and then you can come to us if they have questions.
Thank you so much for both of you joining. I'm just going to look to see if there are more questions. I did see one person who is just maybe a little confused about what mixed status households means. Could you mind just clarifying that one more time for us?
Do you want me to do that, Sarah?
Sure.
Okay. So mixed status household means, in the context of the HUD programs and the RD programs, so U.S. Department of Agriculture programs, subject to Section 214 of the Housing and Community Development Act. It means a family living together in a home where some members have eligible status, so they are under the statute allowed to live in HUD and RD housing, and other family members do not have eligible status. But under this law, Section 214, Congress has said those families can live together in that housing. And so oftentimes what we see is that a minor child has lawful status, and in the HUD programs, they will let the minor child be the person with lawful status, and the rest of the family members, like the mom and the dad, do not, but they can live together in that HUD housing. And then the rent is what's called prorated. to reflect how many people have eligible status. So they only get a little bit of housing assistance and are paying closer to market rent, but they're allowed to live together because that was the intent of Congress.
Thanks for the 101, Kate. I appreciate that. I don't see any questions right now for Esther and Kayla, but just to reiterate that we are going to be coming back to you all when it's time to take action and mobilize and call your members of Congress. And what you can do now is, as I said, sign up, go to the PIF website, sign up for their listserv, sign up for our listserv, stay in really close contact with us as we see things move forward. And if you haven't already built relationships with immigrant rights organizations and housing advocates and made those connections in your state or on the local level, now really is the time to build those relationships if you haven't already. And with that, we'll end today's call a little bit early. I'll just say we are going to go towards having 2 national house calls a month. Instead of doing it monthly, we're going to do it twice in the month. And our next call will be on January 14th, because we are anticipating that we have a lot of news to talk about, a lot of federal updates, and we want to make sure that you all have a forum for getting the information that you need to take action and to mobilize. So with that, we're going to end today's house call, and we'll see you all next month. Thanks, everybody.